One stormy evening, Sarah was helping her grandmother clean out the attic of the old family house. Dust covered every surface, and forgotten items lay in piles, untouched for decades. In the far corner, covered by a heavy sheet, she found a large, ornate mirror with a golden frame. Curious, Sarah wiped off the dust and gazed into it. The reflection was slightly off. The furniture was there, and she saw herself, but something about the room in the reflection felt darker, colder. Then she noticed the reflection of the door behind her was open, but in reality, it was closed. Her heart raced. As she stepped closer to the mirror, she saw something move in the reflection. It was a shadow, a figure, standing just at the edge of the door in the reflected room. Sarah turned around quickly. Nothing was there. Her breath quickened, but she couldn't look away. The figure in the reflection took a step into the room. Sarah watched, frozen, as the shadow slowly approached her reflection. She could see its outline now. It was a tall figure, featureless, but with long arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The reflection's Sarah stood still, unaware, as the shadow reached out. Sarah screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a box. The mirror wobbled, but the figure kept advancing, now standing directly behind her reflected self. Its hand was inches from her reflection's shoulder. Sarah grabbed a nearby sheet and threw it over the mirror, her heart pounding. The attic was silent again, except for her heavy breathing. She ran downstairs, telling her grandmother about the strange mirror. Her grandmother paled and whispered, "That mirror belonged to your great-grandmother. She always said it showed things that wanted to come through." Later that night, Sarah heard a noise coming from the attic. It was faint, like glass tapping, and then a whisper. "Let me in." Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. She tried to shake off the eerie feeling, but every creak of the old house made her jump. Her mind kept replaying the image of the shadowy figure in the mirror, its long arms reaching for her reflection. The tapping from the attic grew louder. It was steady, like someone, or something, was knocking from the other side of the mirror. Sarah pulled the blanket up to her chin, trying to convince herself that it was just the wind, or maybe a loose branch hitting the roof. Suddenly there was a crash. She bolted upright, heart racing. It had come from the attic. She hesitated, then crept out of bed, clutching a flashlight. The stairs creaked as she climbed toward the attic door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, pausing just for a second before pushing the door open. The attic was dark, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing piles of boxes and furniture covered in white sheets. But the mirror, she saw it now, uncovered, standing tall in the corner, reflecting her wide-eyed fear. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Slowly, Sarah approached the mirror. The reflection was no longer off. It showed her and the room perfectly, just as it should. She began to relax, telling herself that maybe the wind had blown the sheet off. Then her reflection smiled, her own face, her eyes, but it wasn't her. Sarah froze, her blood turning cold. The figure in the mirror grinned wider, its smile stretching unnaturally across its face. Slowly, it lifted a hand and waved, mocking her. Sarah's body refused to move, trapped by her fear as the figure stepped closer in the reflection, yet the real Sarah hadn't moved an inch. The figure reached out again, its hand pressing against the glass from the other side. A faint crack appeared at the edge of the mirror, then another. The glass began to splinter, and as it did, Sarah felt a pressure in the room, as though something was forcing its way through from the other side. She turned to run, but the attic door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Panicking, Sarah turned back to the mirror. The cracks in the glass spread like spiderwebs, and through the fissures she could see something dark and writhing behind the surface, something trying to claw its way through. Then she heard it again, clear as a whisper in her ear. "Let me in." The cracks widened, and with a shattering sound, The mirror exploded into shards. From the fragments of glass, the shadow figure emerged, towering over her, its arms impossibly long and its face, a grotesque, twisted version of her own. Sarah stumbled backward, her back hitting the door as the shadow loomed closer. It spoke in a low, rasping voice that chilled her to her core. "You opened the door!" She screamed, banging on the door behind her, desperately trying to escape, but the figure was already upon her, its icy fingers brushing against her face. And then everything went black. When Sarah's grandmother found her the next morning, the attic was cold and still. The mirror lay in shattered pieces on the floor, and Sarah, she was standing in the middle of the room, staring blankly ahead, a strange smile on her face. She never spoke again, but sometimes at night the family swore they could hear a faint tapping sound from the attic, like someone knocking from the other side. Weeks passed, and Sarah's condition remained unchanged. She was physically present but mentally absent, trapped somewhere deep within herself. Her grandmother, racked with guilt and fear, called upon doctors and specialists, but none could explain Sarah's sudden catatonic state. They all left with the same conclusion: trauma. But what had caused it, none of them could say. The old house grew darker by the day, and her grandmother swore that strange things were happening, objects moving on their own, whispers in the night, and the tapping, that relentless, faint tapping. No one else seemed to hear it, but to her it was constant, a reminder that something sinister was still lurking in the attic. One evening, desperate for answers, her grandmother decided to return to the attic. The air was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something rotten. She approached the broken mirror, its shattered pieces glinting in the dim light. Kneeling down, she picked up a shard, careful not to cut herself. As she gazed into the fractured piece of glass, she saw movement, just for a moment, but when she blinked, it was gone. Frustrated, she began to gather the shards, intending to throw them away. But as she did, she noticed something horrifying. Each piece reflected a different scene. One showed Sarah standing at the foot of her bed, her back turned. Another reflected a dark figure in the corner of the room, watching silently. And in one particularly jagged piece, the shadowy figure from the night of the accident was clearly visible, its outstretched arm reaching for her again. Panicking, her grandmother dropped the shards, but before she could stand, the attic door slammed shut. The tapping grew louder now, rhythmic, almost deliberate. Heart racing, she backed away from the mirror shards, but the sound followed her closer and closer until it seemed to be coming from directly behind her. She spun around, but the attic was empty. She could feel it though, that icy presence, the same one that had taken Sarah. The light flickered, and suddenly, standing in the far corner of the room, she saw it. The shadowy figure, tall and grotesque, its face still twisted into that mockery of Sarah's own. It didn't move at first, just watched her, but she could feel the malice radiating from it. "Leave us alone," her grandmother whispered, her voice shaking. The figure took a step forward, slow and deliberate. Then another. It reached the shards of the broken mirror and knelt, picking up one of the largest pieces. As it did, the reflection in the glass shimmered, showing not the attic but a different place, a dark, twisted version of the house where everything was decayed and rotting, a place of endless shadows. The figure extended its hand, offering her the shard. Her grandmother recoiled, backing into the wall, but there was nowhere to run. Then, from the broken glass on the floor, she heard Sarah's voice. "Grandma, help me." It was faint but unmistakable. Her grandmother's heart clenched. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on the shard. The figure remained motionless, waiting. She could see Sarah in the reflection now, her hands pressed against the glass, as if trapped in that twisted world behind the mirror. Her eyes pleaded for help. "Sarah!" her grandmother whispered, her voice breaking. She reached for the shard, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. The moment her skin touched it, a violent force pulled her into the reflection. The next morning, a neighbor stopped by the house, concerned after not hearing from Sarah's grandmother for days. The house was eerily quiet, with no sign of anyone inside, except for the attic. The neighbor found the door wide open, and at the center of the room stood Sarah, still in the same catatonic state, but this time she was smiling. A cracked mirror lay on the floor in front of her, and in its reflection a shadow could be seen, watching from the far corner of the room. Sarah's grandmother was never seen again, and the tapping, it never stopped. The house had been abandoned after Sarah's grandmother disappeared. No one wanted to live in a place that seemed so steeped in tragedy. Over time, stories spread in the village about the strange happenings in the house. Some said they saw lights flickering in the attic late at night, while others claimed to hear faint whispers when they walked by. But the most persistent tale was about the tapping. It was said that if you stood outside the house after dark, you could hear it, a soft, rhythmic knocking, like someone or something trapped inside, trying to get out. Years passed and the house fell into disrepair. But one night, a group of curious teenagers decided to test the rumors. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they dared each other to explore the old house. Their laughter echoed as they pried open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew clung to every surface. The once grand living room was filled with decaying furniture and cobwebs, but none of that deterred the group. They had come to find the source of the stories, to see for themselves what was real. As they explored, one of the boys, Chris, suggested they head to the attic. After all, that was where the strange occurrences were said to originate. Nervous but excited, they agreed. The stairs creaked beneath their feet as they climbed. The air grew colder the higher they went, and a feeling of unease settled over them. When they reached the attic door, they paused. Chris, being the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish, pushed it open. The attic was just as they had heard, dusty, dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through a small, cracked window. Old furniture was strewn about, and at the far end of the room, a large, shattered mirror stood propped against the wall. Chris smirked and stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. "So this is it? This is what everyone's scared of?" The others followed hesitantly, their eyes drawn to the broken mirror. One of the girls, Mia, felt a chill crawl down her spine. "I don't like this," she whispered, glancing around. "It feels wrong." But Chris wasn't listening. He had already made his way over to the mirror. "This is the famous haunted mirror," he joked, kicking one of the shards. It clinked against the wooden floor, and the sound seemed to echo unnaturally in the silence. Then they heard it, the tapping. It started faint, almost imperceptible, but grew louder with each passing second. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the mirror. Mia froze. "Do you hear that?" Chris, trying to brush off his growing unease, knelt down in front of the mirror, shining his light directly into the shattered surface. "It's just a broken mirror. It's not..." His voice trailed off as the light caught something in the reflection. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, something shifting behind the cracks. He leaned in closer, squinting, and then he saw it, a face just beyond the glass, a twisted, mocking version of his own. Chris stumbled back, his flashlight dropping to the floor. "What the... Did you guys see that?" Before anyone could respond, the tapping intensified, faster and louder. Tap, 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 tap. It reverberated through the attic, like someone pounding against the glass. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. Mia screamed, her flashlight flickering wildly as she backed away from the mirror. The tapping had become deafening now, drowning out their frantic breaths. Chris scrambled to his feet, his eyes fixed on the mirror. The face was gone, but the glass was moving, vibrating as if something was about to break through. The cracks widened, and from behind the shattered glass, shadows began to pour out, thick black tendrils that snaked across the floor, reaching for them. "Get out!" Chris shouted, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard they push it or pull it, it remained sealed shut. The tendrils crept closer, wrapping around their ankles, pulling them back toward the mirror. Panic set in as they kicked and struggled, but the shadows were relentless. And then, from the broken glass, a voice whispered, "Let me in." Chris screamed, his body jerked backward, his face inches from the mirror. The twisted reflection reappeared, smiling grotesquely, its hand reaching out through the cracks. Mia cried out, grabbing at Chris, but it was too late. The shadowy tendrils pulled him into the mirror with a sickening crack. One moment, he was there, and the next, he was gone. The attic fell silent. The door, now loose, creaked open, and Mia stumbled through it, her legs weak with terror. She didn't stop running until she was out of the house, her heart pounding in her chest. When she turned back, the house loomed in the darkness, quiet and still. But in the distance, barely audible over the wind, she could hear it. Tap, tap, tap. Mia didn't stop running until she reached her home, her lungs burning and her heart pounding in her ears. She burst through the front door, startling her parents, who had been sitting in the living room watching TV. Her wild-eyed panic was enough to send them rushing to her side, but Mia was in such shock she couldn't even explain what had happened. All she could mutter over and over again was, "The mirror? Chris? He's gone." Her parents, confused and alarmed, tried to calm her down, but nothing they said made sense to her. All she could think about was that horrific face in the mirror and the tapping, the relentless tapping that still echoed in her ears. That night, despite her mother's protests, Mia refused to sleep alone. She lay in bed with the lights on, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the overwhelming fear that something was still watching her. Every little sound made her jump and she barely slept a wink. The next morning, Chris's parents called. He hadn't come home. Mia's heart sank. She didn't know how to tell them the truth, that Chris had been pulled into the mirror by some dark force. But who would believe her? She barely believed it herself. As the day went on, Mia grew more paranoid. She kept hearing noises, faint tapping sounds, soft whispers just out of earshot. She tried to ignore them, but they grew louder as the sun began to set. And then, as night fell, something strange happened. In her bedroom, the mirror on her wall began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to resonate from deep within the glass. Mia stared at it, her blood running cold. She hadn't noticed it before, but her reflection seemed off. Just like in the attic, it wasn't quite right. The light in the reflection was dimmer, the shadows longer, and her reflection, though it looked like her, wasn't moving in sync. It was a fraction of a second too slow, its eyes lingering on her just a little too long. Suddenly, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the mirror. Mia backed away, her heart racing. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the reflection. Slowly, her reflection began to smile, a cruel, twisted grin that spread across its face, and then it spoke, in a voice that wasn't hers. "Let me in." Mia screamed, grabbing the closest thing she could find, a book, and hurling it at the mirror. The glass cracked, spiderwebbing out from the center, but instead of shattering completely, the cracks seemed to pulse, and from behind them, dark shapes began to writhe just like in the attic. The door to her bedroom slammed shut, trapping her inside. She ran to the door, banging on it, calling for her parents, but the room was filled with the sound of tapping now, a constant, maddening rhythm that grew louder and louder, as if something was hammering from the other side of the mirror, trying to break through. And then, through the cracks, she saw it, Chris's face, but it wasn't really him. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and sunken. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, as if he were trapped behind the glass, screaming silently for help. "Mia," his voice echoed in her head. "Help me." She froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob, torn between terror and guilt. Was this real? Was Chris truly trapped inside the mirror, or was it something pretending to be him? The shadows in the mirror grew thicker, swirling around Chris's face like a black mist. They reached out, pressing against the glass, warping it as if it were liquid. Suddenly, the cracked glass began to split further, and the tapping stopped. Instead, a deep, guttural voice rumbled through the room. "You opened the door. Now we're coming through." The mirror shattered completely, and from the broken shards, dark figures began to emerge. Tall, faceless shapes with long, claw-like hands, their bodies made of writhing shadows. They moved toward Mia with unnatural speed, their cold presence filling the room. Mia screamed, backing into the corner, her eyes wide with terror. The figures loomed over her, their hollow faces leaning in close. She could feel their cold breath on her skin, hear their whispers in her ears. Then, just as their claws reached for her, the door to her room flew open and her parents rushed in. The figures vanished instantly, as if they had never been there, leaving behind only the broken shards of the mirror scattered across the floor. Mia collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. But as they carried her out of the room, something caught her eye. One of the shards of the mirror lying near the door. In its reflection, she saw the attic of the old house, the shattered mirror still standing, and in the corner a figure watching from the shadows. The tapping resumed, faint and distant, but never ending. Mia's world had changed after that night. Though her parents tried to reassure her that it was just a bad dream, she knew the truth. Whatever had happened in the attic, whatever had taken Chris, was real, and it was still out there, waiting. The house felt different now. Every mirror, every reflective surface seemed like a doorway to that dark place beyond the glass. She couldn't escape the tapping. It followed her everywhere. At first, it was faint, like an echo in her mind, but as the days went by, it grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It felt like a countdown, like something was building, waiting to break through. She became obsessed with mirrors, covering everyone in the house, refusing to let any reflection catch her eye. But it didn't help. Even in the smallest surfaces, her phone screen, a glass of water, she swore she could see movement. Chris's face haunted her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, trapped in that twisted world behind the mirror, reaching out, pleading for help. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still alive, trapped in some nightmarish dimension just beyond her reach. One night, the tapping became unbearable. It seemed to come from all directions, reverberating through the walls, the floor, her own skull. Mia sat up in bed, her heart racing, her breath shallow. She knew what she had to do. The only way to stop this was to face it. The old house, the mirror. She dressed quickly, quietly slipping out of the house while her parents slept. The streets were deserted, the night heavy with the weight of an impending storm. Mia's footsteps echoed as she approached the abandoned house, now dark and foreboding under the pale light of the moon. The windows were cracked, the once lush garden now overgrown with weeds. The house seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as though it was waiting for her. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door. It creaked open, just as it had the night Chris disappeared. The air inside was thick with dust and decay, and the smell of mildew was stronger than ever. But Mia didn't hesitate. She knew exactly where she was going, the attic. The stairs groaned beneath her weight as she ascended, her flashlight flickering in the darkness. The air grew colder the closer she got, and the tapping, oh, the tapping, it grew louder, more frantic, as though something was banging against the very fabric of reality, desperate to get through. At the top of the stairs, the attic door stood slightly ajar. Mia paused, her hand hovering over the knob, her heart hammering in her chest. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The attic looked exactly the same as it had that night. The broken mirror still stood in the corner, its jagged shards scattered across the floor, catching the moonlight in strange, unnatural ways. But this time the shadows seemed thicker, more oppressive, as though they were alive, watching her, waiting. She stepped inside, her eyes locked on the mirror. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the room was silent, and then a whisper echoed from the mirror, soft but unmistakable. "Mia!" It was Chris's voice, faint but clear. She rushed to the broken shards, kneeling down and picking one up. The surface shimmered for a moment, and then she saw him, Chris, standing in the twisted, decayed version of the attic, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. "Mia, help me," he pleaded, his voice shaking. "I'm trapped. I can't get out." Tears filled her eyes. "Chris, how? How do I get you out?" He looked over his shoulder as though something was coming, something terrible. "The mirror. You have to break the connection. It's the only way. But hurry, before it gets through." Before she could ask what he meant, a dark figure appeared behind him in the reflection. The same shadowy figure that had taken him that night. It loomed over Chris, its clawed hands reaching for him. Mia's hands shook as she looked around the attic, desperate for a way to sever the connection. The mirror was already shattered, but somehow it still held power. She stood, grabbing a piece of wood from a broken chair nearby, and with all her strength, she slammed it into the mirror. The glass shattered further, and the attic shook violently, as though the very foundation of the house was coming apart. But the mirror? It didn't fully break. The reflection wavered, Chris's face flickering in and out, but the shadowy figure remained, grinning, its long arms reaching for her now. The voice returned, deeper and more menacing than before. "You can't stop it. You opened the door." Mia screamed and swung the wood again, harder this time. The mirror cracked, splintering down the middle, and with it, the shadowy figure let out a guttural roar, its form twisting and writhing in agony. The reflection of Chris reached out one last time, his hand pressed against the glass. "Mia, don't let it!" His voice cut off as the mirror shattered completely. Suddenly, everything went still. The house fell silent, the oppressive weight in the air lifting, and the shadows in the attic faded into nothingness. Mia dropped the wood, breathing heavily, her heart still racing. The mirror lay in pieces at her feet, the connection broken. Chris was gone, the shadow was gone. But something felt unfinished. She stood, her legs trembling, and turned to leave the attic. But as she reached the door, she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Mia froze, her blood turning cold. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with horror. There, in the corner of the room where the broken shards of the mirror lay, she saw it, a small, fractured piece of glass. And in its reflection, the shadowy figure was still there, watching her, waiting. The tapping grew louder. Mia's legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot as the tapping grew louder, each knock reverberating in her skull. The fractured piece of glass lay in the corner, small but alive with malevolent energy. In its broken reflection, the shadowy figure's twisted grin widened, its hollow eyes fixed on her, as if mocking her failed attempt to end this nightmare. Her heart pounded in her chest, but something inside her refused to run. This was it, the thing that had taken Chris, that had plagued her every waking moment since that night. If she didn't end it now, it would never stop. Slowly, she approached the shard, every instinct screaming at her to flee, to get out of that house and never return. But she couldn't leave, not yet. She crouched down, her fingers hovering over the glass, trembling. In the reflection, the shadow figure loomed closer, stretching its long, clawed fingers toward her. As her fingers brushed the edge of the shard, a sharp pain shot through her hand. She gasped and pulled back, seeing a thin line of blood form across her palm. But as her blood dripped onto the glass, something changed. The reflection shimmered, the shadows inside twisting and writhing more violently. The figure let out a low growl, its grin faltering. Mia realized something. The connection, the force that had trapped Chris and unleashed this terror, was tied to the mirror. The blood, her life force, was somehow weakening it. She needed to destroy the last of it completely. But how? She looked around the attic, her eyes landing on an old oil lantern that sat on a dusty shelf. Without hesitation, she grabbed it, her hands shaking as she unscrewed the top and let the oil spill over the shard, soaking the surrounding floor. The figure inside the glass seemed to panic, its form distorting, its hollow eyes narrowing in rage. The tapping turned into pounding, so loud now that it seemed to shake the walls of the attic. Mia fumbled in her pocket, pulling out a lighter. Her fingers trembled so much that it took several tries to get a spark. But finally, the flame caught, flickering weakly in the dark. With one last deep breath, she dropped the lighter onto the oil-soaked floor. The flame spread instantly, catching the oil and racing toward the shard of glass. The fire licked at the broken mirror, and as the flames engulfed it, the shadowy figure let out a deafening, inhuman scream. The attic filled with the sound of shattering glass, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Mia's breath came out in visible puffs. But she stood firm, watching as the fire consumed the shard, the flames dancing higher and brighter. The figure inside twisted and thrashed, its body distorting and breaking apart, its form flickering between this world and whatever nightmarish dimension it had come from. "Mia." The voice was faint now, fading but unmistakably Chris's. "Thank you." Tears welled in her eyes as she watched the last of the mirror crumble into ash, the shadowy figure dissipating into nothingness, leaving behind only silence. The tapping, finally, was gone. The flames began to spread across the attic floor, licking at the old wooden beams. Mia knew she had to get out. She turned and ran, stumbling down the stairs as smoke began to fill the house. The air was thick and choking, but she pushed forward, crashing through the front door and into the cool night air. Behind her, the old house groaned and crackled as the fire spread. She stood in the street, gasping for breath, watching as the flames consumed the house, the structure that had harbored so much darkness. It was over. The fire department arrived soon after, but by the time they extinguished the flames, the house was nothing more than a charred ruin. The authorities questioned Mia, but she couldn't explain what had truly happened. No one would believe her anyway. All she could say was that it was an accident, that the house had caught fire and she barely made it out. Weeks passed and the nightmares slowly faded. The tapping was gone, and the mirrors, once a source of terror, now held nothing but her own reflection. But she never forgot Chris, or the sacrifice he made. She had broken the connection, freed him from whatever that place was. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside and the house creaked, Mia thought she could still hear it. A faint, distant tapping, just at the edge of her awareness. And she wondered if, somewhere behind some unseen mirror, the shadow was still watching, waiting for its chance to return. Mia thought her life had returned to some semblance of normality after the fire. She tried to move on, but deep down, she felt like the story wasn't truly over. Though the nightmares were less frequent, something nagged at the back of her mind, a lingering sense that she hadn't really escaped. The tapping had stopped, but the unease in her soul hadn't. Weeks turned into months, and Mia started college in a nearby town, trying to bury the past. But one evening, while sitting in her dorm room studying, she received a text message from an unknown number. It read, "Did you forget me?" Her blood ran cold. She stared at the message, her fingers frozen above her phone's screen. It was impossible. The only person who could have sent that was Chris. But that couldn't be right. Chris was gone. Her heart raced as she quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "Come back. You left something behind." She could barely breathe as the familiar dread settled over her. Her fingers shook, and despite herself, she texted back, "What do you mean?" This time, the reply was a photo. It was blurry, but she recognized it instantly. A shard of the mirror, the one she thought had been destroyed in the fire. There it was, lying on the charred ground of the old house. Somehow it had survived. Her mind raced. How? She had seen the mirror burn, watched the flames consume it. It was supposed to be over. But as she stared at the photo, a chilling realization washed over her. The fire had destroyed most of the mirror, but not all of it. A small piece had survived. And with it, the evil that had haunted her for so long. It was still out there, waiting for her. Mia threw her phone down, her hands trembling. She tried to tell herself it was just a prank, someone playing a sick joke. But deep inside, she knew the truth. The figure in the mirror, the tapping, it was all connected to that final shard. That night, she barely slept. Her dreams were filled with flashes of the old house, of Chris's voice calling to her, of the mirror pulling her back into that dark world. When she woke the next morning, she knew what she had to do. There was only one way to end this for good. She had to go back. Mia returned to the town where the old house had stood. The neighborhood had changed after the fire. The charred remains had been cleared, and the lot where the house once stood was now empty, surrounded by overgrown weeds and silence. But the air felt thick with something dark, as if the remnants of that nightmare still clung to the place. She parked her car on the edge of the lot and stepped out, her heart pounding in her chest. The memory of the fire was still fresh in her mind, and the weight of unfinished business pressed down on her. As she walked toward the empty lot, her foot crunched on something brittle. She looked down. It was the shard. There it lay, partially buried in the dirt, glinting faintly under the dim evening light. Her breath caught in her throat. How had it survived? As she knelt down to pick it up, a cold breeze swept through the air, sending a shiver down her spine. She hesitated, her fingers inches from the glass. Then, with a deep breath, she grasped it. The moment her skin touched the shard, the world around her seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the familiar tapping returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. She could feel it. The connection to the dark world beyond the glass was still there, alive and hungry. "Mia," Chris's voice whispered, so close it was as if he stood beside her. She whipped around, but there was no one there. Just the wind and the empty lot. But she could feel his presence, weak, fading, but still trapped. Mia stood, clutching the shard tightly in her hand. She knew now what she had to do. The shard was the last piece of the puzzle, the final connection between her world and the one where Chris was trapped. She had to destroy it completely, but not here, not without fully severing the bond. She drove to a nearby quarry, the place where her father used to take her as a child. The deep, cold water seemed like the perfect place to rid herself of the last shard. The dark forces couldn't survive there, deep in the water, away from the mirrors and reflections that had haunted her. Standing at the edge of the quarry, Mia held the shard in her hand, feeling its unnatural coldness seep into her skin. She could almost hear the voices again, the shadow figure's mocking whisper, Chris's desperate pleas. But this time, she didn't hesitate. She drew her arm back and hurled the shard into the water with all her strength. It hit the surface with a splash, and for a moment the water rippled unnaturally, as though something beneath the surface had been disturbed. Mia watched as the shard sank deeper, disappearing into the murky depths. And then, silence. The air seemed lighter, the tapping gone, the presence of the shadow no longer pressing down on her. It was over, truly over. Mia stood there for a long time, watching the water, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The dark force was gone, and with it, the nightmares that had tormented her. She walked away from the quarry, the weight finally lifting from her shoulders. Chris was at peace now, and the darkness that had haunted her life was buried beneath the water, never to return. But as she drove away, she didn't notice the faint ripples that began to form on the surface of the quarry. And deep beneath the water, something stirred, something waiting. As Mia drove away, she couldn't shake the lingering unease, even though she had done what was necessary to sever the final connection. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the winding road back to her town. She told herself again and again that it was over, but a small voice in the back of her mind kept whispering otherwise. The days that followed were strangely quiet. For the first time in months, there were no nightmares, no eerie tapping, no whispers from unseen forces. Mia went back to her life, and for the first time in months, Mia felt free.